Could we get Rick and Lynette and I think Allan up to sit over here, and we can just have a discussion for the next 45 or 50 minutes. Just I started writing down some words, and others have added to it. Paul mentioned yesterday part of the solution was care delivery action plan to remediate historical ills. I think he's really laid that out here. We've talked about transformational accountability, responsibility, litigation, conversion without humiliation, from the Gandhian ideas of without violence, duties versus rights, etc. So maybe this can help frame this last discussion.
One more word that I'd like you to put up there is
Sure.
testimony.
Testimony.
And corporal works of mercy, you could call something like, humble service, caregiving. I mean, there are lots of words that don't even invoke professional training, but which all of us can and do, regardless of our professional training.
So why don't we open this up? Jim, go ahead, and then Roger.
Okay, I wanted to just address, just love the presentations this morning. Allan brought up an issue that provoked a thought in my brain about, I think, a dilemma that many of us face here, which is, we talked about sort of the corruption of historians by the tobacco industry. And I had a really interesting talk with Lynette last night at the reception about dilemmas we all face around who do we take money from. So accountability in our own world here, I think among many of us, and at HAI, half our board quit when we took money from USAID. We had to justify that. But we were constantly, struggling with, do we take money from Big Pharma? And Big Pharma finds ways of inserting itself into the donor world in very clever ways. The Department of Defense, for example, is getting lots of PEPFAR money, getting lots of USG health money. We have the emergence of AFRICOM across Africa that's trying to pull together the security apparatus with the humanitarian apparatus. So we're faced with these dilemmas which get a little bit grayer, and I don't know how to begin to talk about accountability around those kinds of issues and those kinds of things. And your presentation about tobacco just kind of raised those in my mind. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I'm not sure what to do with that, but those are actually, in some cases, tougher dilemmas. And I know that Lynette's organization is facing some decisions right now around this as we are at HAI. It's really a tough, slippery slope. And, in terms of accountability, how do we hold ourselves accountable? I guess the last point that you made was about rationalization, the psychology of all of this, and how I find in our own organization, how we've come up with very, very clever rationalizations about why we might take money from a really, really sketchy source to do this work. Anyway, just want to put that out there.
Questions? Would that be more?
Let me just take this quickly because I think it's a great question because what we're finding, as we do historical work is that all of our institutions are compromised in fundamental ways. That doesn't surprise me. But if we said, well, given that history, we paralyze ourselves, that would be a mistake also. That said, I think there are some lines to draw here, and that being morally sensitive to those lines and explicit about them is absolutely critical. So I don't know if some of you may have seen it. There was a press release this week. Philip Morris International is about to create a end tobacco smoking forever campaign. And I think they're going to spend $80 billion in the next 50 years. And they've signed up some very important people, people who have incredible credentials in public health. And, somebody called me up, they said, we could potentially get millions for really great things. And I said, you can't do it. And, Harvard Medical School, until very recently, was taking tobacco money for research. And the researcher said to me, but I don't do anything on tobacco, so why can't I take it? And I was very clear that, I don't think you can take that money. So part of it is well, then our development office has the idea, well, it's better not to know. So that's unacceptable also.
Yeah,
But,
can I just add one thing, James, to the back to the drug-resistant TB example. A very thoughtful journalist who covers from Indianapolis, actually, who covers has covered health issues, was asking me. This is maybe 10 years ago, what are you doing at Lilly headquarters? And I said, trying to get the drugs that they alone make and get them to the people. And these are, I mean, I won't go into medical details, but they're very, like, our friends and patients who have died needed those two drugs. And I'm completely ambivalent about that. And a very interesting thing happened over the ensuing decade, or even 15 years, which was the transfer with their help of the manufacturing capacity of these very complicated drugs, I didn't know that part back then, to generic manufacturers. And then the other obstacles became not how much the drugs cost, but would our own allies and friends and peers who went to Johns Hopkins, Harvard, et cetera, now in international health bureaucracies, stop saying that it was not, and then fill in the blank, sustainable, cost-effective, feasible, rational, to actually move those drugs into those bodies, you know. And, you know, I think this discernment process, another old school Catholic word that Allan just went through, and then I think history and historians are particularly suited to do, is hard in real time, as you know from your work and as Lynette knows from hers, but not impossible. Anyway, I don't know if that was a helpful example.
That's very helpful.
I keep saying this, but wonderful presentations, food for thought. Yeah, too much thought, actually. I'm going to have to focus. But when Paul mentioned the Treaty of Westphalia, my first thought was, well, that's a random historical reference. But actually, it's very important, like all history, because it raises the question, how do we construct history? How do we understand history? How do we learn history? I learned the Treaty of Westphalia as the end of irrational violence between the European Catholics and Protestants, and, you know, very bloody period, 30 preceding that. But that's one side of the coin. It's true. What's the other side? It ushered in the age of imperialism because these European countries stopped using military power against each other because that was hard. Like, I'm not going to steal your stuff. Keep your stuff. Let's go steal the stuff in Africa and Latin America. That's easy. And we may kill our millions, but we can kill their hundreds of millions. You look at history. And so that's history, right? And that's real. And I think it's important to unearth that. And I have to say, Lynette, I was a little upset with Lynette for not giving us a trigger warning about how emotional seeing the faces. I mean, I'm joking, of course. But, you know, I felt very emotional. You know, I felt like crying. And yet I spend all my years in the field talking to people who suffer so much, and you put up a wall because you can't feel that way, or it's hard to do the work. So, you know, this is kind of a safe space, which I think is really important, to be able to talk about this stuff without having to fight. You know, everything is a fight. When I was younger, I liked to fight. I don't want to fight anymore. But you have to. You know, and it's pessimism is not an option. When you're in a village and you're talking to people who suffer something, and these people are willing to fight, and they, you know, they're going to do this. Are you going to be part of that or not? Right? So a couple quick things, which is how do we conceive of this, you know, language or art? So I was thinking, okay, if you are a big tree, I am a small axe, to quote Bob Marley. Not me. We have 30 small axes in this room. You know, what can we do? But it's not a regular tree, right? It's a tree with kind of a Star Trek force field. Yeah. And that force field is law. Law protects these big trees, right? And politics protects them. And at the base of both of that, I do feel is money. I mean, I hate to make it that simple, and I'm sure it's not. And you know, all kinds of people can criticize me. Sometimes it's, you know, money is behind military power, political power, the construction of law. David and Goliath, right? We're David. But David didn't fail better. David won. He kept winning so much. We're tired of winning. Now, how did he win, actually, was mind over muscle, brain over brawn. He had better technology. if he fought in the arena that Goliath wanted to fight, he'll be ripped in little pieces, but he had a slingshot. So the question is, where is our slingshot? That's what we're asking. What is our slingshot? How do we do it? And we've all been doing this for a long time, and I don't think anyone has found the silver bullet or the golden thread or whatever you want to call it. But so I now want to be, that's the background, and thanks for indulging that. And I want to talk about the World Bank specifics. What can we do? And so I think the first thing, which has been mentioned by everyone here, and so I just think we should accept everyone's experience, which is multi-prong lawsuit as one element. And I mentioned this, but I really think research, documentation, without that you lose, because power lies, power protects. Community participation, mobilization. No point to do work without that. Any change you might get will never be implemented on the ground without people on the ground leading and fighting. Media exposure. You need that. I mean, how else do you get it out? The truth is not enough, sadly, right? Then, that's the basis. Then you have 4 and 5. Then you have litigation, strategic. You can't do it without that stuff. And then you have policy change. And you might say, really, all we want is policy change. Who cares about human rights as great ideas if there isn't policy change? And actually, I think that's true. But it's not all there is, because to be seen is important. People are not victims. People are actors. And for them to enter the stage is important, even if they lose. And I learned about law from a good professor as theater. Yeah, it's theater. We might as well wear those long white things, right? But it's a certain kind of theater. It's an arena of conflict in which poor people are totally disempowered, totally. Like, they don't show up, maybe So that's a problem, unless you link it with all these things. So specifically on the World Bank, okay, I could say, you brought it up, the law protects the World Bank. Immunity, right? But they are not protected, just like the tobacco companies are not protected from reputational damage and from education and knowledge. And so if, all these facts, I mean, again, I've been in this a long time, but I'm a bit stunned by the wealth of evidence against, policies based on nothing for 30 years with this impact, all the evidence. So I do think, bring it to the public, not just us, obviously. The research is key. And you go to the past, this should be compiled in an executive summary form. You could put lots of footnotes, but user fees. Everything in the last 20, 30 years, you said it, now you say it's wrong, okay? Where's the compensation? It's not okay to be foreseeably known, it's not okay. And now what are the things today that you're doing that 30 years later, because we know it now. Don't tell us it's, Now, if you have the other thing that I think is useful, which frankly I don't do anymore, because I'm no longer an idealistic young person who thinks out of the box. Well, hopefully I'm a little thinking out of the box, but big project. Be ambitious. Take the meta on, because through the micro, right? And we talked about, bring law. So that's my other thing. Bring the young generation in. Law students, every law school now has a clinic where people go out, and Harvard has a great one with Tyler, and, Yale has a great one too. I know we're very Harvard-centric here, which is really a terrible thing, actually, but we don't want to get into that. But I don't think we have the same, as far as I know, in medical school, public health school, the same level of clinical. Maybe I'm wrong, and I just don't know. No. Okay, so let me explain. No, I don't mean clinical in terms of all the work. It has to be clinical, but clinical taking, say. Okay, I totally walk that back. But so here's so let me change that, because actually the law and the public health and the medical clinics, the students need to work together. It's not just doing the medicine, it's not just doing the law, and that's quite powerful. You get that together, not only you educate the next generation, but you can get the prestige of the schools, you can get great research and think out of the box, and it's free. Which matters to NGOs. Where do we get our source of resources and funding? Well, this is a small but very easy one. So, and the final thing is, World Bank, I was part of these whole efforts to like get legal accountability, including for corporations. Failed. Codes of conduct, that's what we have. Basically voluntary codes of conduct. That's the weakest. But we also have regulations that are internal that are violated all the time, like your own charter. Can't lose in court on that. But when you, all that evidence and getting powerful, getting the academics, mobilize your team and put it out in a single way and go for all of that. And I'm not saying, that's to me the best way you can take on a very difficult situation.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Wendy?
Sorry for taking so much time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I really wanted, I'm sitting here struggling to understand why, I guess, institutions which are effectively people are acting in ways which are intentionally causing harm. And I keep coming back to the space around groupthink, where you materially have to sit with the in-group and decide that the way that you are metering out effectively inhuman outcomes is because you are the out-group you have made inhuman. And it's really bringing us back to the leadership and governance processes at the level of people and how those people are interacting, and to stand up and call it out. A number of speakers have talked about how they were ridiculed, how they were vilified. I mean, there were some really strong words used. So to call it out as it is, as inhuman acts against humanity, is actually taking a huge amount of courage. It takes a huge amount of courage. And as an educator, I'm sitting here thinking, what have I done in leading a university and so on? What have I done to help my students when they graduate to be courageous in calling out acts of inhumanity? And so the groupthink space for me, I'm going to go back to, because the failures of governance that groupthink accounts for, many of them. They are extreme examples in world history. But to see smart people act in ways that we consider are stupid, is one thing. But to see smart people act in ways where poor and largely black and minority ethnic individuals are piling up in body bags, groupthink must be somewhere at the heart of this leadership governance at an institutional level. But let's not hide behind institutional organizational labels. Let's remind ourselves that these are people like us who are acting in ways of self-interest, but also failing to be courageous. So how can we tackle the groupthink? How can we enable courage in the leaders of tomorrow through the work that we do as educators? So I just want to kind of throw that out there because I'm struggling in that space.
Thank you, Wendy. Marcos?
This is a question for Allan. I think that many of the crucial issues raised by Paul have to do with a project that you are developing now on stigma. Epidemics usually come with blaming the victims, with scapegoating. But at the same time, I understand that you're studying how stigma can change. I wonder if you can say something about this to a general discussion.
Thanks. I'd like to say a little bit about it because, there are so many things that are discouraging, and one of them is the durable, persistent character of stigma that makes some people of no value in comparison to others. And so it underlies a lot of the discussion, I think, because a sort of neoliberal view is to sort of say everyone's on the same playing field, and people who get ahead have done the right thing, and people who are poor or diseased have done the wrong thing. And, this was the debate at the Chipolone trial, do we need to hold people accountable for what happens to them as individuals, and don't we? And so when people have bad outcomes, it's because they did bad things, and it's at the core of stigma. But I've seen stigmas reduced, the stigma of cancer. There's obviously gigantic stigma about HIV, but a lot of people wouldn't have anticipated in 1985 or even 1995 that the expansion of treatment and the capacity to care would have been so well represented in the epidemic despite all the obstacles. So I think if we could understand those social processes and those mechanisms that now are historical, at least to some degree, then we might be able to figure out what are the triggers, what are the places that are so important. So I started with the idea of how did we get in the United States to marriage equality? And, you know, the strategy was the law. If you had put this out into red and blue states, we would be nowhere. But where does it really begin? It began with a group of lawyers and activists in 1973 getting homosexuality out of the American Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual. And that sort of surprised me a little bit. Who cares? You know, it's in a diagnostic manual, it's a professional organization. But they realized very early on, and imagine the AIDS epidemic if homosexuality was still in the diagnostic manual. So it was crucial. And then what I did is some of the same people, the lawyers who were there in 1973 were the lawyers who founded the Lambda Legal Defense Fund in 1985. And those are the lawyers and their progeny who have led the marriage equality movement with the law. So, you know, there are a lot of bad stories, and, you know, understanding the persistence of the stigmas of mental illness and addiction, of tuberculosis, you know, these are crucial. But are there strategies that history might show us where the levers are, where the potentialities are for change? And sometimes they're in small things. You know, I've been talking to people about the opioid epidemic. It really means a lot to people to not be called a substance abuser.
Yeah.
And like, I thought those things, well, that's a linguistic thing. It's not that important. But I was talking to somebody with a disability, and he said, you know, I'm a person with a disability. I'm not disabled. And, you know, that's the language that I learned around AIDS. And these things have possibilities. You know, both of our major federal agencies for drug policy have abuse in their title.
A lot.
You know, that's an amazing thing, you know. And so small things can lead to bigger things. Lawsuits can lead to activism. So, you know, I think one of the things that historians might do is they show these arrows going in many different directions. And, you know, the problem for historians, of course, is that we're trying to look at many variables all at one time. But actually, I think that's the way the world really is.
I'm so sorry for the images. I'll give you a hug after it. Yeah, let's hug.
Me too.
No, let's hug. But I also think that you need to take a break. You clearly haven't taken a break. You really need to take care of yourself. And that's what I've learned in this work for all of us. I encourage all of you to take a week or two of sabbatical, switch everything off, and just like, I don't know, go somewhere and just keep quiet and meditate. It really does help. It keeps you sane because you'll never stop seeing this stuff, and it's only going to get worse, I feel. I think fundamentally what I'm really worried about actually is, you know, when we talk about what is our slingshot and we use the David and Goliath analogy, I think we're not learning from the viruses, right, or the bacteria. They are very clever. I was like, I wish I was the HIV virus. I wish I was the TB bacteria, because those bitches have got it going on, excuse my French. But really, it's true. But how are they able to just, everybody, you know, I mean, you all understand how they both work, especially HIV. Let's learn from HIV in terms of our tactics. Because as I said, we we do have strategies, we've got toolboxes, but I think we keep trying to use the same strategies. And that's where we're finding blockages. I mean, in HIV, we used children, right? The gay movement in South Africa failed to try and raise their agenda. But as soon as you started using PMTCT and dying children, then people started listening. We used Nkosi Johnson as this young child who died, who was dying of an epidemic, and people started listening. So I don't know if TB children work, and that's what I'm saying. We're trying to save the babies. That's not working so well, and it's one of those things. What is in the toolbox, and what can we use, and what can we learn from these diseases themselves? Thank you very much, Wendy, for the think space ideology. I think that is it's very powerful. But I think in general, and if we're really just honest about ourselves, people are just allergic to poor people, right? Anything that's poor, that looks dirty, is just like, maybe stay away from that. Not good. And I mean, when I was talking about guerrilla warfare 2 days ago, I mean, my idea was really a radical one, to say, you know what, I'm sorry, but you can try, the EU can give the AU as much money as possible to keep Africans contained within Africa. It's not going to happen, right? Could we maybe just, as people suffering from MDR, TB or whatever, could we just go out there and cough? Because in the first case of MDR, TB that really freaked people out was that cartoon. Remember, there's a cartoon of somebody who'd visited South Africa, I think, an American person who was on a flight, and then the person had MDR, TB, and it became such a big thing when he landed. It was like, oh, they bringing it here. And I think we need to take the diseases or whatever it is closer to home, to those people that we're talking about. So I don't know, you get it to WHO on their headquarters if the travel restrictions say, if you've got tuberculosis, if you need to screen for tuberculosis in some countries. And I think Geneva is one of those. But if you have those types of things, then it holds you back. But I really do think that we really need to be that radical, because we do not, that as well, stigma is political. Stigma is political, it's religious, and it's power. They will use it when they have to use it. And unfortunately, if you're brown or black or Eastern European, you always literally fall to the wayside when it comes to power. And I think Majid must speak a bit to what he was saying yesterday about, what is it? The horse can't be friends with the grass, because what will the horse eat? That was powerful to me.
I just want to say regarding what Roger was saying about the policy has to get changed, and with user fees, the policy was changed, but it was only changed after years and years of activists pushing. People like Rob Yates, right here with us, my old boss Joanne Carter, at Results in Washington, she helped mobilize thousands of people to pressure the U.S. Congress, to pressure the U.S. Treasury, to pressure the World Bank. Lots of people in Uganda, who mobilized and told Museveni to get rid of these things. So there's thousands of activists in different places at different times pushing and pushing. That's how the policy finally changed. But like Randall said yesterday, which sent a chill up my spine because he was so right. He said, look, the user fees policy is changed now, fine, but you can get rid of user fees, but the budgets are still too low for the health system.
Works of mercy.
The budgets are still too low. So
You need to actually take care of people.
well, what it means is that the IMF problem is still the real problem. You see, the user fees was always just sort of a symptom of the IMF problem, the deeper problem. The IMF wasn't going to let you spend. And if the health systems didn't have enough to spend, they resorted to user fees out of desperation. Not that the World Bank guys didn't have their free market ideology they were pushing, but I'm just saying the deeper problem always was the IMF problem. So that's still with us. It's going to be with us. If Bill Gates wants to come out and help us fight against that, because he realizes now the health ministries need more money, we welcome his support. Even though I'm happy to criticize Gates on GMOs and what he's doing in agriculture, I still say that, if he wants to stick his neck out and use his name to fight on this problem and get these health systems adequately financed, you have to deal with IMF. So I just want to say last thing, Wendy, I think the most important thing academics can do is inspire their students to become activists. I think that's probably the most important things teachers can do. And that was the greatest compliment I got. I used to lecture in California at the university level. And my second favorite compliment, my first favorite compliment is now I can argue with my dad. But my favorite compliment with my students is Rick, your classes make me want to become an activist. And I think that's the real thing. It's you have to teach them, the courage. You're right.
Well, I may have jumped in too early, being about what you were saying. but to respond to your point, what strikes me again is that policy change is not the ultimate goal. And we have abundant evidence of policy changes that lead to nothing of import to poor people. And we have examples which are very inspiring. And, Allan's example of marriage equity, there's a legal approach that was based on activism, right? And but my fear, and it's a fear I know many people share, all of you share, is again, what happens to those people who are already shafted, right? Because they're already sick or they're about to be, right? The user fees already, hurt them, and diminish their families, right? Or they already have worked in the mines, or they already have, ingested water from a river in central Haiti, or they, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I'm saying, what kind of world is it where people who are our friends and peers invest energy into making some futures, aspirational futures, less likely for poor people who are largely people of color? I mean, again, this is not just like neglect. No, it's like we can't treat cancer in poor countries. We can't do surgical or deliver trauma care, in poor. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia wasn't an accidental reference, right? Because if you fight for a trauma center in Chicago, it becomes increasingly difficult to say, not that part of Chicago, or that's our policy for Brooklyn, but not Manhattan, right? So, just like law is a double-edged sword, so too is the nation state, and so too is sovereignty. But, I really, the difference that I hear when I'm headed back to Haiti and then to Sierra Leone, the difference I hear is I almost never hear in a clinic or a village, and I actually still live in the same village, and it's still an annoying village where people are in your face all the time. I have almost never heard anyone say, what we really need is a policy change here. And, they want material, substantive change, and I mean, I can't imagine any of you has had a different experience, that these are the things you hear about. School fees, tin roofs, electricity, food, freedom from want. And, that's why the human rights paradigm that ignores social and economic rights is so suspect in the eyes of so many of the world's poor. And they call themselves the poor. I mean, everywhere I've worked. It's only at Harvard where I have people say, stop essentializing poor people by calling them poor. Where I've worked, they're like, we, the poor, we, comma, the poor, comma, and, it's I get it at Harvard or Yale or Duke, but not there. And they're asking for medical care, and they're asking for basic services that we have and they don't. And anyway, I just think the idea that a policy victory is the end of it, it's just the beginning of better implementation, whatever we call it. Service delivery, which is another ugly bit of jargon, but what the shafted, and I certainly don't represent them, which is why I never told my getting hit by a car story, what people who have been on the losing side of a bitter struggle that has gone on and on, they're very often asking or demanding material things which in no way undermines the quest for dignity or sovereignty. On the contrary, it is having students, as you said, and to have students, you have to have teachers, and they can't be lined up, and they have to have lunch programs, and those material. And I'm not trying to sound like a hardcore Marxist, but this is exactly what the reverent listening, being quiet and sitting down in a village or a city or a squatter settlement or a slum or a detention center or a prison. It's just been stunningly the same in all those places. You be quiet, and that's what you're going to hear. And so policy changes that are immaterial are only focused on some, ideological notion of dignity, sovereignty, whatever, is just not enough in a world driven by this kind of disparity, and I'm sure it never was.
Let's take another round of questions. We'll start with Tom, then Rob, then Majid, then Sinead, then Jean, then Mona. Okay.
Yeah, first of all, the kind of existential dread and sadness that I'm feeling is definitely overwhelmed by being so happy to be in this room, so thank you to everyone. And this is connected to many comments, both Roger's, Wendy's, Lynette's emphasis on tactics, Paul's mention of understanding goals, which, we've come up with this question of what's motivating these kinds of policies and actions. And I think it's important to look beyond just, we're looking at goals and tactics on our side, which we should be, but these tactics don't matter if we're not considering the tactics, not just the goals of what we're fighting against. And I think actually, a lot of these are very disingenuous things. The idea of sustainability, cost effectiveness, any of these kind of buzzwords that are employed, be it the utilization of user fees. I think these are tactics. I actually don't think they're goals. I think the goals were laid out really clearly, and I'm just an amateur historian, but my reading of it is the pump was primed in the 70s with this kind of, it's an outright hatred of poor people. Neo-Malthusian, talk about interdisciplinary. The guy who was the head of Columbia, or very senior Columbia law professor, also the co-founder of the World Food Program, also Deputy Secretary of State at the State Department, or one of the Assistant Deputies of State, Richard Gardner, was at the time proposing these grand bargains for survival with, everyone outside of the developing world. Well, he said, you give us access to your resources as long as you have less of you. So that was 10 years before. This is all public record, New York Times. So I think that it is about, the goal is actually, for some of the people, the agenda setters may be a bit more sinister. And I want to think that the sustainability ideas and the cost effectiveness ideas are tactics to get there. And speaking of delivering, they're really good at delivering on their tactics. I think we can learn from them in a rather sinister way how to effectively implement what your tactics are with goals in mind. But I think if we're going to have these executive summaries of what we want to do and think about what the tactics will be, we have to have a very good sense of what the opposing tactics are, not just the goals.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd really build on what Tom was saying, because I think we have been talking about tactics and toolkits about sort of getting what we want. And we have been focusing mostly on litigation and using evidence and rather sort of traditional methods. But I'd perhaps like to have had more discussion, and if we can have another session on this, looking at the role of media, investigative journalism, and even sort of the dark arts of public relations. That we know that our opponents, they do this. They're very effective. The whole Trump phenomenon, is this just bombarding people and shock tactics, using individual cases, this idea that the NHS is falling apart because immigrants are using our health services. We know this is absolute nonsense, but it gets a lot of media coverage. Now, I'm not saying that we make things up, but that we use our best tactics, use our shock cases. I think the film that you put up, Lynette, stopped us all in our tracks. All the talk suddenly, it just made so much sense when you saw those, sort of guys there, sort of dying of TB. And for, the area I've been looking at, I've been dying for ages, for someone to make a film about medical detentions, sort of people locked up in hospitals as we're sat here, mothers and babies chained to radiators because they can't pay their user fees. And to be perfectly honest, I think some really shocking film of that would be so much more effective than papers in the Lancet and things like that. And to think of opportunities that could, say, be shown at the World Health Assembly to organise a side meeting and invite maybe the minister from Cameroon and Nigeria and sit them down and show them that, and then have the world's media there to film their reaction. These types of tactics, I think you might seem sort of underhand and discomforting, and we're not very good at that. But I think if we are going to succeed, that as we continue with the litigation, to have some of these things. I think there was a very good example from South Africa around the time of the ARV medicines battles, when it was litigation that was being followed. But at one point, I think the NGOs managed to engineer it that Mandela was going to be giving evidence in the very court that had sent him down to Robben Island. And, this was a PR stunt as much as anything, but was a masterstroke. And when the pharmaceutical companies realized they were heading for that public relations train crash, then they sort of settled. So I think if we have another session like this, it would be really great to get some, sort of someone who is a master of the dark arts to sort of, say, you could take that case and, we could put this here and we could really cause trouble with this. I think it would be quite useful.
Sorry, those tactics are very dangerous because, for instance, the activists that participate in that generally disappear when they go back home. So the shrinking space of civil society means that they're arresting more and more of us, and we're not able to come out anymore. Like in Zimbabwe, so many people have gone missing. We don't know where they are. So we're fighting against that in terms of using that particular tactic, but it is a good one.
What about activists?
No, I mean, if you're the activist going there to the World Health Assembly and
but if you stage something with actors and then added statistics, I mean, I think it's okay.
Majid?
Thank you. I have two questions, and before pondering my question, I have something to share with you. Like, I think all of these institutions or some of these hegemonic sort of powers, they don't work alone. They have some sort of nexus and some sort of ties, and they do contribute to certain sort of things. Like if it is tobacco, it does contribute in the economy of a country, and economy does regulate, and it does contribute in the tax of a country. Like there are certain sorts of industries. Before asking my question, this is what I was thinking about, and you have to make me correct as well, and I think this would give a different notion. Like there is a tobacco industry, there is drug industry, then there is sex tourism industry in the world, and all sort of these industries are having some effect on the health of the people. And when it comes to health, it comes to these global institutions, and then it comes to the pharmaceutical industry that is having its own weight in global level and among these all institutions. And once it comes to the pharmaceutical industry or health stakeholders, then it comes to global global democratic policy makers, and then it comes to national governments. Like this is a cycle what I do see. My question is, how do you see the relationship between these industries? Like if it is tobacco industry, its relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, and then with the global policy makers, because I think there are some sort of common interest of all of these people. This is my one question. And what can be the recommendations, how we can, like it is a big tree and we are small axes, and how we can just break it down. And the other question is, like, once we see if there is a United Nations or some IFIs, international financial institutions, or it is health institutions, WHO, or so many, I think so it is an ideology that was developed 50 years before or more than this. And the people who are working in these institutions, they work just like in the concept of structuralism. Structure is the same with the same ideology, but the faces, the people keep on changing, and they do follow that ideology within which it was constructed and it was developed. And now my question is, there are countries, there are nations for whom there is developed international justice code, and they do come and they present themselves and they are answerable in the concept of nationalism and nation state. But why these institutions are not supposed to be present before that court, and how this ideology can be changed. Either it can be changed through legislation of the participating countries, or it can be changed through giving awareness to those participating countries that are basically that develop its body and its structure.
I think, yeah, I think I'm the next question. Actually, don't have a question. I just wanted to say, I think I'm going to be one of these people who has to slip out the door in a few minutes. So I wanted to, I do have something else to say, but I just wanted to say, in case I don't get to say goodbye to many of you, this has just been a really fantastic and rich few days. And I really hope that we keep in touch. And I, I just want to invite you and Salman, maybe you in particular, and others who have specific points for, sort of WHO and World Bank and various people who in my new job I'm engaging with their governance systems at whatever, whatever small efforts I can make. I'll be really happy to be better informed and enabled by what you might send me. My comment was just maybe a little bit of a caution in my line of work. We talked about, how it's good to share tactics and what really worked and that kind of thing. But I often find that what gets shared is actually not what really happened. And so when there's, these successes and everybody's like, and it was really because of this great mobilization of people. And a lot of times I might find out from my interactions that it was actually more some very non-democratic backroom deal between some donor and some, and so and I don't mean to say that it's never the very kind of community mobilization. Of course it is, but I feel like it's not helpful if we always feel the need to frame successes in terms of the way we would like them to have been achieved, as opposed to often the way they are achieved, because that won't enable us to actually get better at achieving them, which comes a little bit back to James's question on sort of shaking hands with the devil and so on. To me, it's all very case by case, and it's very difficult to kind of generalize on that. But I guess I would just encourage us all to be honest about why things that we've been involved in have been, successful, and not just feel the need to give the politically correct story of what happened.
So, Paul, your mom said, look both ways. She might have also told you, like mine did, the pen is mightier than the sword. And, I grew up thinking that. And so when I saw the Lynette's brilliant presentation of her work in that video, I said, wait a minute, Randy already wrote that 30 years ago, and how come it hasn't caught on? And then I looked to my work, and I like to think I'm doing something, but, Paul wrote Infections and Inequalities, however, 20 years ago, and I'm just doing what that book said, and why am I employed if it's already out there in print? And so maybe it's not the pen is mightier than the sword. Is it the YouTube is mightier than the sword these days? I kind of like this idea of, there's more than there's the tactics, the toolbox is pretty big. And so it brings up the question, well, what are we going to do with our book? Are we going to be just another book that we ourselves use as a springboard, or are we can we get radical with it? Maybe send some drones and drop it like leaflets onto the the UN compounds in Geneva. So I just read yesterday the Amazon drones can carry 5 pounds. So we had a bunch of drones, drop them on the UN where all those peacocks are, at the UN compound in Lake Geneva. You see all those peacocks, drop them right next to them. And then, so just to think about going forward, our product, how can it be a little more outside the box? Yeah.
Hi, again, trying to be short, maybe not as short as 1 minute, but maybe 2 minutes. I think there is a common thread with the three stories that these three tragedies embody, which is each one of the organizations responsible has turned its purpose on its head. The UN is supposed to be about promoting accountability and human rights. Its actions in Haiti did the exact opposite of that. The World Health Organization is about promoting health. Its actions in tuberculosis, drug-resistant tuberculosis, did the exact opposite. It actually hurt health. The World Bank is supposed to alleviate poverty. Its user fee policy has in fact accentuated and damned those who are poor. They have to get back to their original purpose. Again, it's getting back to the basics, that is the common thread, and holding them accountable to the fulfillment of their purposes. Member states are giving them money to fulfill these purposes, and they're actually betraying those purposes. And I think that's the report card that we need to issue. Governments have credit ratings. Let's use their own tools against them. We don't have to call them moral ratings. We can call them credibility ratings or purpose ratings or whatever you want to call it, and unite around that, each of us with our own stories. Not 400-page heavy books, but one-page concept notes that illustrate the shock to the conscience that each one of these stories represents, with one very powerful picture. The picture of the blood-stained staircase was revolting and therefore causes a revolution. Revolt has two different meanings and should mobilize not just this meeting of minds and hearts, but the broader minds and hearts of mankind. The image that you just talked about, the image of the sewage just going into the tributary in the river in Haiti would be enough to shock the conscience of mankind and bring it back to the essence of it. So I think I don't consider it dark art, I consider it mobilizing humanitarian instincts that I still believe most human beings on the planet have. We got to wake up that part of every human being and make sure that they're aware first and foremost, and then that they're angry, and then that they do something about it.
One last comment from Rowden.
Allan's lecture this morning was that he mentioned there can't be accountability without demand. And so the question is who are the end users? So WHO is the organization I'm most familiar with, and I've heard it said that WHO is accountable to its member states. But it's not really the member states, it's really the end users are the citizens. And I think that, and to Beatrice's point about from as a clinician and as a public health researcher, I think it's not that difficult to find doctors or public health researchers, I think, that would be prepared to stand up in a court case against Philip Morris. But I think when you're thinking about organizations like the UN and the WHO, who we think of as these forces for good, and they do a lot of good work, I think it's much harder to think about what, and so that's why I think getting to Rick's point about what is the actual goal, because the court case is not the goal, it's a means to an end, and what should that be? I think in public health, we've kind of moved much toward more emphasis towards implementation science and really understanding how do we translate advances to the bedside and to the field, and this kind of iterative approach. And so how can we do that at the policy level? Because we don't want, I think, and what do we want? Are we saying we want to abolish these big organizations, or are we saying we want them to function better according to their constitutions? And how can we do this such that if policies are made, when do they get reevaluated, and how do we use evidence as the evidence makers? How do we hold these organizations accountable such that they can function without being paralyzed? So I think that that's one of the big questions. And then the other thing I wanted to say, related to Lynette's point that I think many people have made now, is that it's critical that we are all activists as well as clinicians and researchers, and that's something that has increased in my own life. And I think that one of the problems is that empowering the communities, the demand has to come from the communities too. But I think some of it is really thinking about, in TB, for example, we've talked about TB control rather than TB care. And I think what Lynette said is that we focused, none of us would argue about the public health consequences of a disease like TB, but we focused so much on the public health impact over the individual care aspect. And so we've lost the support of the communities. And I think we have to really think about how to mobilize them such that we can achieve their goals.
Thanks, Rowden. Before everyone responds to this in the 10 minutes that we have left before the bento boxes are served outside, before people have to catch their planes, I just think that Paul has put out an interesting challenge throughout this whole meeting, which is that we've really focused on accountability, responsibility, in terms of litigation and how do we enforce duties and rights and things, and Paul has thrown out this idea of humble service, of the corporal acts of mercy, of praxis. What's the role of that? And I think Wendy, when you're saying what gives people courage, is it somehow linked to praxis? So as you're responding to this series of questions, maybe just we think about that when you're thinking about strategy, where is the role of actually doing this, delivering the care and service, or if delivery is a problem because it gives a trajectory, ensuring that care is available. Where does that play a part? So let me hand it over to our group for the next 10 minutes.
Can I just, can I start?
Yes, please.
And you pick up on what you left, where you ended. And Salman, thank you so much for adding that. And I doubt that anyone feels like they don't want to serve humbly in this room. I mean, obviously there are people who don't and won't, and I'm not naive, but the point you raise is the point that Gene and I were trying to raise. And it's the point raised by Allan in his first book and by Randy in his first book, right? People are not looking to be controlled or counted or restrained. They're looking for care. And that's what I was trying to say about the corporal works of mercy. The tuberculosis, what has happened with tuberculosis and Ebola, and has been attempted again and again around HIV, and as Lynette said, is actively being litigated to control, not to give care. So it's the inversion of that caregiving contract, right? So again, this is why I was trying to move away from medical versus legal versus caregiving is what the major caregivers, of course, is your mother, is your family are the major caregivers, right? And each of those, just speaking from in first person, 35 years of working in this arena, the international community, a sociologically complex and self-designated group in which we all fit quite comfortably and often, right, makes that mistake every time. That the one that you described around TV, right? TV control. My friends, and these are close personal friends. It's not a disparagement. They call themselves TV controllers, and yet when people start coughing or threaten to do so to bring attention across, to Geneva, they're not asking to be controlled. When people have spike of fever in West Africa at a very difficult time, they're not asking for isolation, quarantine, or punitive measures. When people are in prison, they are looking for people to visit them. So, if you look at those corporal works of mercy, they're about that kind of activism, which does include teaching, right? Which does include, especially though, learning and listening. And this is the problem, the central problem in public health. It is not the central problem in medicine, because you don't go to work as a clinician in a hospital or a clinic and expect people to come in and say, hey, can you help control this epidemic in my house or neighborhood? There are plenty of problems in clinical medicine, and by that I mean nursing, social work, psychologists, etc. But the basic idea is reverent audition, meaning listening to people and then responding to what they're asking you to do, and it's been stripped out of a lot of professions, or big chunks of them. Social justice was a root part of public health in the 19th century. It got stripped out in the latter half of the 20th century, and development economics played a big part in that, as has been noted by Rick and many others. But Gene's usual provocative style, what are we going to do with this? By the way, he always has good ideas. And my idea, I didn't know that a drone could carry 5 pounds. But the point is, most of us are academics. Our job is to produce. If you're a historian and you're going to write you're going to use archives to do a book like the Cigarette Century, right? But that doesn't mean that regardless of what we do, that we can't be involved in that kind of humble altruism, which gets mocked all too often. And it should be embarrassing to mock humble altruism. I mean, visiting prisoners, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. The worst thing about going back to Haiti at September and January, always the same thing. It's user fees, right? Not for clinical care, but to go to school. That makes it almost intolerable to be an American who has a big fat Harvard salary to go back to a place like that. And it's like, I can't imagine that you don't all have very similar experiences. These are material problems that injure dignity, right? And I'm not I'm not looking at you. I'm just looking at you because you open this door to say it's like people aren't looking for control. They're looking for solidarity, compassion, care, affection, all the things that we would want were we ill or injured or imperiled. And I'm done. I swear.
That was hard to talk after Paul sometimes. But Paul's obviously right, but I guess the question that I have, and the question that is so frustrating, is we might well ask, as we have over and over again, I think, over these last 48, 72 hours, like, who's against corporal works for the poor? And what we find is that, well, everybody would say, of course, I'm for that. I'm for caring. I'm for the professions and their professional ethic at the bedside and repeated over millions and billions of lives for large populations. What we're finding, as you understand, and I think everyone in the room understands, is that the obstacles to feed the hungry, bury the dead, visit the prisoners are substantial, they're structural, they're deeply built into policy and practice. The corporal works of the poor are undermined even in our medical schools and in our academy. So, so I find myself frustrated and, eager to find opportunities to resist those forces, and they're real and they're, purposeful in many ways, that make this so difficult. And I think that, we've gotten into some dichotomies that really are not helpful to us anymore, which is, caring versus control sometimes. And of course, control is, that seems like such a good idea, but it's toxic, between the problems of populations and the problems of individuals, between, I've written about this, public health and medicine. I don't see where the oppositions are, but we've constructed them in such a way that, we've created, and our world is filled with obstacles to being able to do the right thing. And so, in this way, I'm into sort of small acts, and this is, I think, sort of what you're arguing, Paul, is that, little things can lead to bigger things. Historians line these things up as if there was some linear chronology, and there rarely is. But I think what everyone in the room has conveyed is both their moral outrage and their desire to do something that they can do, that they have the capacity to do, where they can, be linked to other people doing important things. And, kind of keeping that burning in some ways is like, sue someone, put on a play. They're incredibly different. But they could be linked in some way, in some authentic and decent way, that really we've seen make differences, And one of the most gratifying things I imagine of being at the bedside is you really, you see when you've listened well. And, we have to figure out those gratifications and those recognitions and the ability to, we've made so many things invisible that we have to revisualize or remoralize. And I think that's what the discussion's been about.
Yeah, just a few things about, well, first of all, I just want to say one organization we haven't talked about at all, and for health people, I'm sort of surprised that it didn't come up, but when it comes to pharmaceuticals and patents, is the TRIPS agreement of the WTO and TRIPS Plus, but it's even worse than WTO because now they're going even farther with the patent enforcement and the patent protection, and by extending the patents and expanding the scope of the patents in the free trade agreements, the regional and the bilateral free trade agreements. Some of them are crazy, going way farther than TRIPS and what's in WTO. And this is also true not just for the trade agreements, but for the investment treaties, bilateral investment treaties, or some of the trade agreements have investment chapters. That's also a whole other field of work. There's a lot of great people working on that, but I'm surprised it didn't come up while we were here, because that's a huge problem. And there's a lot of good people fighting that. That's an important fight for you all. Just a few things about activism generally. I'm still laughing about what you said. You said when we go up to people and we say, oh, we're trying to sue the UN for what they did with cholera in Haiti, and they just would take a step back from you. It's like, oh my God, that was my life for like 5 years in Washington. I'm like, I go up to these NGOs, and you say, yeah, we want to fight against the IMF. Well, IMF's one of the biggest, scariest, powerful entities in DC, especially for all the NGOs working on foreign aid issues. And I have to say, one of my biggest disappointments, I dropped out of my PhD the first time in Denver, Colorado, to go work with the IMF and World Bank protesters in 99, 2000, 2001. There were these awesome, huge protests. I don't know if you guys know that history. And then it all got swept away after the 9/11 attacks and everything changed and stuff. And then I stayed on in DC for years after without the protesters, like, going to work on IMF and World Bank issues in DC with the protests, and then being in DC without the protests. And it's no fun being there the years later without the protests. And I have to say, I was terribly disappointed in my colleagues, in my NGO colleagues, who I expected to be fired up and to want to fight. And I would be shooting off my mouth from the back of some conference room, and people come up to me at the coffee break and be like, oh, good job, Rick. Yeah, right on. I'm so glad you said that. I'd be like, well, where were you, dude? Why didn't you weren't there either? And the thing is, people are just really careerists, at heart. I mean, they don't want to say something that's going to script their career. And we just have to accept that that's a serious part of human nature, and it's reasonable for people to be afraid. But I also there's a couple of great quotes I love. I'll just tell you. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, I used to have this on my fridge. I love this. He says, everything I ever did in my life that was worthwhile, I caught hell for. and it's true. And another great quote that I love is, people are afraid of activists, and they think, ooh, activists, scary, they're going to get in trouble, they're going to get tear gassed, they're going to get arrested, like, why, But there's this great quote, I don't know who said it, and maybe nobody said it, but it's a great quote. It says, democracy is not a spectator sport. And nobody's afraid of the word democracy. We all are supposed to love democracy. And what does that mean? Democracy is not a spectator sport. It means you don't just sit in the stands and watch it like a football game. You actually go down and you get involved, from the littlest things, like write a letter to your congressman, go to a meeting, do a little street theater, whatever it is. There's so many things people can do at so many levels. And you shouldn't...
Allan and I are going to dance. Yeah, we are.
So you shouldn't be afraid of activism. You got to find a way to make people not be afraid of being activists, And so I just want to say, with IMF and World Bank, we have had some successes. We've had some victories. Big victory was the debt cancellation, HIPC, debt relief, getting debts canceled in these countries. That was millions of people, pressuring their governments. The user fees victory, that was millions of people pressuring their governments. So when we think of these monolithic entities, they're really comprised of the executive boards that make the decisions. Those are governments. Those are individual states and their representatives. Those are governments that can be pressured by people in their own countries. The key is to coordinate people across different countries, coordinate the timing of that pressure, and to do it in a sustained way that will really matter. That's the hard part. But these things are movable, and we can have victories with them, but it's hard. But don't forget that they're comprised of individual governments, and each one of those governments is susceptible to pressure. So that's the last thing I would just say, is that, some of my real heroes are this group called Earth Rights International. And they've been doing crazy stuff, like with lawyers and international law, trying to sue some of the U.S. oil companies down in Ecuador and South America, trying to bring 100-year-old case law, to bring it forward and use it, and, to say you're responsible for your actions, your environmental pollution down there. And Earth Rights International is great. And you guys, if you don't know them, you should check them out, because you're definitely kindred spirits with everything we've been talking about here. They do crazy stuff, but they try to use the law to go after multinational corporations. And we should be talking to them. They're great.
Thank you. Just a few, parting remarks. I think, Dr. Farmer, will carry on being the communities and the people and the poor people who are actually, continue the corporal acts of mercy. Unfortunately, we're the only ones that care at the end of the day, and we're the ones that need to lead by example. I know it's annoying, but it's being a good child and leading by example, and it's fun because it's our families who are, at the end of the day, the ones that are suffering. It's our communities. We live in these communities, so it is important for us to take the lead if we can, and if we're in privileged position to do so. So I see it starting there, and to be honest, that is all that I can do as Lynette. I can't do any more, unfortunately. I was going to actually answer back to Sinead about the whole, not claiming victories and so forth, but that is our story. That is what we know, that is how it happened. So we don't know what happens in the back offices. We don't know what happens in the corridors. We only know our part, the part that we played. And if we sell it well, I think if nobody's going to come to us and disprove what we know as fact, then it's our story. I want to also speak a bit about Phumeza Thusile. I don't know if some of you colleagues know her, but she was the girl who got MDR TB, worked with MSF. She went deaf because of one of the drugs. And then, of course, through crowdfunding, she got cochlear implants. And Phumeza right now has gone through since she got MDR TB when she was 21, and she suffered for like 3-4 years. But thank God she's okay now. And she's now at UCT doing her undergrad in law. And she has moved away from the world of activism because so many people send her requests, Facebook, SMSs, whatever, asking her, how come you're the one that got cochlear implants? Where are mine? How do I get them? And why are you so privileged? And the burden of her success, if you look at it that way, or for her being healed, has been her being bombarded by the public as to now she's being vilified and she's had to hide, which is very scary. I think one thing that I'll take away from this wonderful, wonderful weekend is Dr. Sams's pretext philosophy. I think that is what I will take home in terms of lessons and what I commit to doing. Because our education system in South Africa and other countries, well, South Africa, I can speak about it because that's where I live, is really bad, and elementary education is really bad, and that is where we need to start in terms of creating the activists, in terms of creating the feminists, in terms of getting the kids to start thinking about their reality. And I think for the next 10 years, my personal plight will be to work with the education system in South Africa to try and change it so that it tries to, it has a more robust curriculum. And I promise to report to all of you in 10 years in terms of how far I've gotten. 10 years is what I need.
I'd like to just say some closing remarks, and people can stay here because we'll end shortly. Catherine Admey brought up our mission at some point here about, to close the global care gap is both intellectual and moral. And, I think obviously people were chosen to come into this room based on their amazing contributions and very moral contributions. And so it's no accident that this group, seems to be so in sync with each other. I think we've seen here, over the last 72 hours that there is some relationship, some very intimate relationship between the places where people suffer and these spaces where power is exercised, in the policy sphere, and really thinking about how to actually negotiate that and be the wedge in different parts of these spaces. And so I think, this discussion will continue. Aaron is going to help this discussion continue by writing to everybody for their chapters, and then we'll figure out which drones can airlift it to wherever they have to go. But I think all of us want to be the mimes on the street, and we want to be the ones that are really figuring out how to direct these different spaces in the right direction. So I want to thank, of course, Sue and Jen and Liz and Bea and Hannah for helping us organize this. They've been amazing, so let's give them a hand. But I also want to thank everyone here, because everyone's given up a weekend, and I think it's been really, for me at least, I feel humbled and I feel enriched, and every night I've gone home and thought, oh my God, this is so incredible. So I hope, I sense it's been the same for everyone here, and I hope that we'll just leave energized. It's been painful. It's been painful to watch some of these things, but I think there is a path. We'll be energized to think about it more. So thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you all very much, and enjoy. Take care.